I never thought a snow blower could change my life. But then again, I never thought I'd be standing in my driveway at 7 in the morning, knee-deep in 18 inches of fresh powder, getting lectured by a woman in a fur-trimmed parka about the angular direction of my discharge chute. That was the morning everything changed in Pinecrest Meadows, and honestly, looking back on it now, I wouldn't trade a single ridiculous, infuriating, ultimately hilarious minute of it. Let me back up and give you some context, because this story doesn't start with the snow blower. It starts with moving into the neighborhood 2 years before, back when I was just a regular guy named Ryan Foster who bought a house, signed the HOA paperwork without reading every single line, because literally nobody reads every single line, and figured the worst thing the HOA would ever do to me was send a passive-aggressive letter about my grass being a quarter-inch too tall in August. I was adorably naive back then. Pinecrest Meadows is one of those suburban neighborhoods that looks like it was designed by someone who really wanted everything to be uniform. Every house has the same style of mailbox, the same approved color palette for exterior paint, the same type of fencing if you want fencing at all, and the same 2-car garage with an automatic door opener that has to be a neutral color. The lawns are manicured in summer. The holiday decorations are regulated by a published schedule in fall and winter, and God forbid you put a basketball hoop in your driveway without getting it pre-approved by the architectural committee, which is a real thing that exists in our neighborhood and meets every third Tuesday. The HOA board was 5 people, but for all practical purposes it was one person. Her name was Deborah Mercer. Deborah was in her mid-50s, had silver-streaked hair she wore in a severe bun that seemed to communicate her personality before she even opened her mouth, and drove a pristine white SUV that she kept spotless even in the middle of a Minnesota winter, which is honestly an impressive commitment to misplaced priorities. She'd lived in Pinecrest Meadows for 11 years, had been on the HOA board for 8 of those years, and had served as board president for the last 4. In that time, she had personally issued more violation notices than the previous 3 board presidents combined. She kept a tally on a spreadsheet. I know this because she mentioned it proudly at the annual HOA meeting like it was an Olympic medal. I had crossed paths with Deborah a handful of times in my first year in the neighborhood and managed to stay under her radar. I waved politely, kept my lawn mowed, didn't put up Christmas lights until the approved date of December 1st, and generally minded my own business. My neighbor Greg Tillman, who had lived there for 6 years, warned me early on that staying invisible to Deborah was the key to a peaceful life in Pinecrest Meadows. Greg was a soft-spoken retired engineer who spent his free time building elaborate birdhouses in his garage, and who had himself been the target of 17 violation notices over the years, including one memorable incident involving a garden gnome that Deborah had deemed not in keeping with the neighborhood aesthetic. Greg told me all of this over the fence one early October afternoon, leaning on a rake while leaves swirled around us both, and concluded by saying very seriously, "Ryan, whatever you do, don't give her a reason to look your way. Once she focuses on you, she doesn't stop. She's like a laser that wears a parka." I laughed it off. 2 years later, standing in my driveway with an official HOA violation notice in one hand and a snow blower in the other, I would think about Greg's words and wish I had tattooed them on the back of my hand as a permanent reminder. The winter in question was the worst one we'd had in about 15 years. It started early, back in November, with a freak snowstorm that dropped 8 inches overnight and caught everyone completely off guard. The city's plows were overwhelmed. The roads in our neighborhood were icy sheets of compressed slush for the better part of a week, and half the neighborhood was making emergency calls to heating companies, because furnaces that hadn't been serviced in years were suddenly struggling to keep up with temperatures that dropped to -12 at night. My neighbor across the street, Phil Garza, had his pipes freeze and burst in the first week of December, and he was dealing with a flooded basement while simultaneously shoveling his driveway by hand because he couldn't get a plumber out for 3 days due to the backlog. It was that kind of winter. I had bought my snow blower the previous spring at one of those big box stores during a clearance sale when all the winter equipment gets marked down to make room for lawn mowers and garden hoses. It was a 2-stage gas-powered Ariens with a 24-inch clearing width, electric start, and a discharge chute that could rotate a full 260 degrees with a quick-turn handle on top. I had bought it specifically because I have a long, wide driveway that curves slightly, and shoveling it by hand after a big storm is a nightmare. The thing was a beast. It ate through packed snow like it was fluffy powder, and that first big November storm, I had my entire driveway and front walk cleared in about 25 minutes while Phil was still out there with a shovel, red-faced and sweating despite it being 15 degrees outside. That's when I first noticed Deborah watching me. She lived 3 houses down from me on the same side of the street, and I caught her standing at the end of her driveway in that fur-trimmed parka, arms crossed, watching me work. I waved. She did not wave back. She just looked at the snow blower, then at me, then back at the snow blower with an expression that I can only describe as someone who has found a problem but hasn't quite figured out what it is yet. I didn't think much of it. She was just watching a guy clear his driveway. No big deal. The second storm hit in early December, a serious one, about 14 inches over 2 days. I was out there at 6 in the morning both days, running the Ariens up and down my driveway. And on the second day, I was also clearing part of the sidewalk in front of Greg's house because his back had been acting up and he couldn't manage it. The wind was brutal that morning, coming from the northwest and driving the wind chill down to something like -20. So I was working fast and efficiently, pointing the chute away from the street to avoid shooting snow onto the road where it might ice over and create a hazard for the cars that crept along our street like nervous turtles on the slick surface. I was pointing the chute toward the strip of grass between the sidewalk and the street, which seemed logical. The snow landed on the grass, piled up, and stayed there. Nobody got blasted with a face full of flying snow. I thought I was being a responsible neighbor. I finished Greg's section, did my own walk twice because the wind kept blowing stuff back, and went inside to warm up with a cup of coffee that I'd earned about 4 times over. 2 days later, I got a knock on the door. It was Deborah. She was holding a clipboard. She actually had a clipboard, which told me this was not a casual social visit. She also had that expression on her face, the one that Greg had warned me about, the one that said she had found her problem and filed it alphabetically in her brain already. "Mr. Foster," she said, and her tone was the kind of professional bataille that people use when they want to sound official while being deeply annoying. "I'm here on behalf of the Pinecrest Meadows Homeowner Association regarding a matter of community guidelines compliance." I leaned against my doorframe and looked at her. The cold air was coming in around her, and I could see my breath fogging in the space between us. "Good morning to you too, Deborah. What's the matter?" She looked down at her clipboard like she was consulting sacred documents. "During your snow removal activities on December 8th and 9th, your snow blower discharge chute was observed pointing in a direction that has not been approved by the HOA. I stared at her for a moment. The wind gusted, and a little drift of fine snow crystals swirled between us like nature itself was commenting on the absurdity of this conversation. "My discharge chute," I repeated. "That is correct. The metal thing on top of the snow blower that the snow comes out of." "Yes, Mr. Foster." Per Article 7, Section 4 of the Pinecrest Meadows Community Standards and Guidelines, all snow removal activities must be conducted in a manner consistent with the aesthetic and functional standards of the community. The discharge of snow must not be directed in a way that creates hazards, unsightly accumulation, or any impact on common areas, neighboring properties, or community roads without prior approval from the Architectural and Grounds Committee. I absorbed that for a second. You're saying I needed to get my snow blower chute direction approved. The direction of discharge, yes. Specifically, the chute was observed pointing toward the common grass strip, which is HOA maintained property. Depositing snow on HOA property without a formal request and written approval constitutes a violation of community guidelines. She tore a sheet off her clipboard and held it out to me with a little flourish that reminded me of a bailiff serving court documents. This is a formal notice of violation. You have 14 days to respond in writing or appear before the board at the next meeting. I took the paper. I looked at it. It was a real, printed violation notice, complete with a case number, date, description of the alleged violation, and a list of potential fines ranging from $50 for a first offense to $300 for repeated or uncorrected violations. I looked back up at Deborah. The common grass strip that's currently buried under 2 feet of snow and ice and is completely inaccessible anyway. The location of the strip is a documented community asset regardless of seasonal conditions. Deborah, I took a breath. Where exactly was I supposed to point the chute? She blinked. That would be subject to approval by the committee. But there wasn't an approved direction. Correct. An approved direction had not been established because no request had been submitted. So I needed to submit a request before using my snow blower. For non-standard discharge directions, yes. And what is the standard direction? She paused slightly, and I noticed it. That has not yet been formally established by the committee. I stood there for a second, letting the cold air wash over me, holding the violation notice, and looking at this woman who had apparently decided that the angle of flying snow coming out of a machine I owned, in my own driveway, during one of the worst winters in 15 years, was worth driving 3 houses down, knocking on my door, and presenting me with official paperwork. And I decided, right there in that doorway, that I was done being invisible. I'll be at the next meeting, I said. She looked mildly surprised, like she'd expected me to fold immediately. Very well. December 17th, 7 o'clock, the community clubhouse. I'll be there, I said. Thanks for stopping by. I closed the door. I looked at the violation notice. Then I took a photo of it, sent it to Greg with the message, "You were right, she found me," and went to make more coffee while I thought about what I was going to do next. Greg came over that afternoon. His back was better, he was moving more freely, and he sat at my kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee while snow pinged against the windows, and we talked about Deborah Mercer and the Pinecrest Meadows HOA. Article 7, Section 4, Greg said, reading the violation notice through his reading glasses. She's been expanding the reach of that clause for 3 years. Started with a notice to Mrs. Kapoor about her leaf blower, then moved to the Hendersons about their pressure washer. Every year it gets a little more creative. Has anyone ever pushed back? I asked. Greg sipped his coffee. A few people have gone to the meetings and complained. She runs the meetings, though. Literally runs them. She sets the agenda, calls on speakers, and cuts off anyone she doesn't like after 2 minutes. Last spring, Ray Domings tried to challenge a fence violation she issued, and she talked over him for 40 minutes straight until he gave up and sat down. What about the other board members? Greg made a face that said more than words. Tom Busby does whatever she says. Carla Nguyen used to push back, but Deborah got her removed from a subcommittee she cared about, and she's been quiet since. Dennis Falk is barely present and just votes with the majority. Sandra Cho is the only one who sometimes disagrees, but she's 1 vote. I nodded slowly. So she's basically running a one-woman show. With a rubber stamp board, yeah. Okay. I leaned back in my chair. Then I need to do a little reading. What I did next was spend the better part of 4 evenings going through the Pinecrest Meadows CC and RS, which stands for Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, and is the actual legal document that governs what the HOA can and cannot do. I printed out all 47 pages, made myself a pot of tea each night, sat at my dining room table while the wind rattled the windows and the temperature outside dropped steadily, and read every word. I took notes. I highlighted things. I cross-referenced the community standards document with the CC and RS, and what I found was genuinely interesting. The community standards document that Deborah had cited was not the CC and RS. It was a separate set of guidelines that the board had adopted over the years, and according to the CC and RS themselves, any guidelines adopted by the board had to be ratified by a vote of the general membership at an annual meeting to be enforceable. The board could create guidelines, but they couldn't make them binding without membership approval. And when I went back through the meeting minutes, which were publicly posted on the HOA's website because state law required it, I found that Article 7, Section 4 of the Community Standards had been added by a board resolution in March of 2 years ago, at a regular board meeting, with no general membership vote. It had never been formally ratified. That meant it wasn't actually a valid, enforceable rule under the governing documents. I also found something else interesting while I was digging through those meeting minutes. In November of the previous year, the board had voted to raise HOA fees by 15%, citing increased maintenance costs. But looking at the community's financial disclosures, also publicly required by state law, I noticed that the maintenance budget had only increased by about 3%. There was a line item in the financials labeled Administrative and Consulting Fees that had gone from essentially zero to over $12,000 in a single year, with no itemization and no vendor name attached to it. $12,000 paid to nobody, at least nobody named. That got my attention in a different way. I called my college buddy Jake Harmon, who had gone to law school and was now a practicing attorney specializing in property and contract law. Jake and I had stayed close over the years, and he owed me several favors from our shared youth that we never talked about in polite company. I explained the situation to him, and he laughed for about 30 seconds at the discharge chute part, then got serious when I told him about the unratified guidelines and the unitemized financial line. The guidelines issue is straightforward, Jake said. If they weren't properly ratified, they're not enforceable and the violation notice is baseless. You can make that argument at the meeting and you'll win on the merits. The financial thing is more interesting. That could be nothing, could be bad bookkeeping, or it could be misappropriation of funds. You need more to know which. What kind of more? I asked. A formal written request for financial records. Under your state's Nonprofit Corporation Act, since the HOA is incorporated as a nonprofit, members have a statutory right to inspect the financial records. Put the request in writing, send it certified mail, and see what they give you. I sent the request the next morning, certified mail to the HOA's registered address, which was listed on the state's corporate records database as Deborah Mercer's home address, because of course it was. The week before the board meeting was busy. I talked to Greg, who was fully on board and started making his own calls to neighbors. Phil Garza, who had spent 3 days with a burst pipe and flooded basement, while the HOA cited 2 other neighbors for having slightly too much snow piled in their front yards, was extremely willing to attend the meeting. Sandra Cho, the one board member who sometimes pushed back, agreed to have coffee with me one afternoon, and over lattes at her kitchen table with fresh snowflakes falling past the window, she told me things about Deborah Mercer that made my eyebrows stay elevated for most of the conversation. According to Sandra, Deborah had been gradually steering HOA contracts toward vendors she had personal connections with, and the administrative and consulting fees, line item that I'd spotted was something Sandra had also questioned at the budget meeting, only to be told by Deborah that it covered legal and management consulting, and that the details were proprietary. Sandra had asked for documentation twice and received nothing. She'd stopped pushing because she said Deborah had made her life in the neighborhood unpleasant in ways that were hard to pin down but very real, including suddenly finding violation notices on her own property for things that had been ignored for years. I've been wanting someone to actually challenge her for 2 years, Sandra said. But she's aggressive and she controls the meetings and most people just don't want the fight. Most people haven't had their snow blower chute direction rejected, I said. Sandra smiled for the first time in our conversation. She picked the wrong guy. I also did one more thing in the days leading up to the meeting because something Greg had mentioned stuck with me. He'd said that Deborah had been watching me during that first storm back in November, standing at the end of her driveway. That meant she'd been paying attention to me for a while before issuing the violation. Which made me wonder if there was more than just bureaucratic principle at work here. Greg told me that back in the spring, there had been a brief and polite dispute between me and Deborah at the annual meeting, where I had voted against a proposed assessment for new decorative lighting on the front entrance that Deborah had championed. The proposal failed because enough homeowners voted against it, and I had been one of the more vocal opponents. Greg thought that might have put me on her list. That kind of personal motivation, using HOA authority to target someone who had opposed you politically within the community, was exactly the kind of thing that crossed a line from being an annoying HOA busybody into something potentially actionable. I filed that away. The night of December 17th was absolutely brutal. The temperature had dropped to -8 by the time I drove the 4 blocks to the community clubhouse, which, yes, I drove because walking 8 minutes in -8 degrees, when you don't have to, is a choice only extremely principled people make, and I was saving my principles for inside. The road was glassy with ice, the streetlights threw cold white circles on the packed snow, and the parking lot of the clubhouse had maybe a dozen cars already in it by the time I arrived at 5 to 7. I was not the only one there. Greg was there, wearing his heavy wool coat and carrying a folder. Phil Garza was there with his wife Maria. Sandra Cho was already seated as a board member. There were at least 25 homeowners in the room, which was apparently the highest attendance at a board meeting in 4 years, according to Greg, who had been to most of them. Word had gotten around. When you live in a community of 140 homes, and the story going around is that the HOA president issued a violation notice over the direction of a snow blower discharge chute in the middle of the worst winter in 15 years, people show up. Deborah arrived 2 minutes before 7, saw the room, and I watched her process it. She was good at keeping her face neutral, I'll give her that. She took her seat at the head table, arranged her papers, checked that the other board members were seated, and called the meeting to order without acknowledging the unusual turnout. Tom Busby looked slightly uncomfortable. Dennis Falk was on his phone. Carla Nguyen was staring at the table. Sandra Cho caught my eye and gave me the smallest nod. Standard agenda items went first. Deborah ran through maintenance updates, road condition reports, and the upcoming spring planning schedule in a brisk, efficient way that I could tell was designed to eat time and get to the open forum portion as late as possible, when people would be cold, tired, and wanting to go home. But nobody left. The room stayed full. When the open forum finally opened, Deborah said the usual line about each speaker having 2 minutes and staying on topic. And then she called on a homeowner near the back I didn't know, probably expecting softball questions. Instead, that homeowner, a guy named Marcus Webb who I'd never spoken to, stood up and said he was there to hear about the snow blower issue because he'd gotten a similar notice about his snow shovel throwing snow toward the sidewalk, which he said was the most rational place to put it. And he'd also like to understand the approval process for snow removal direction, because it had not been communicated to residents at any point. Deborah said the guidelines were available on the website. Marcus said he'd looked and couldn't find any approved direction listed. Deborah said the committee would be establishing approved directions shortly. Someone from the middle of the room said, "So there's a rule that requires approval but no approved option exists." The room got louder for a second and Deborah called for order. Then it was my turn. I stood up and I could feel the room's attention shift. I'd prepared for this and I knew what I was doing. I started calm and methodical. I received a violation notice on December 10th for using my snow blower in a manner that discharged snow toward the common grass strip on the street side of the sidewalk, I said. The notice cited Article 7, Section 4 of the Community Standards. I've spent the past week reading both the Community Standards document and the CC&RS very carefully. Deborah's expression was patient and faintly dismissive, the expression of a person who is sure she's about to hear an uninformed emotional complaint. Article 7, Section 4 was added to the Community Standards by Board Resolution in March 2 years ago, I continued. According to Section 12.3 of the CC&RS, which govern the authority of the Board, any supplemental guidelines or rules adopted by the Board become binding on homeowners only upon ratification by a vote of the general membership at a duly noticed annual or special meeting. I checked the meeting minutes for every meeting since March 2 years ago. This provision was never put to a membership vote. It was never ratified. Deborah opened her mouth. I have the CC&RS here, I said, holding up the printed copy with the relevant sections highlighted in yellow. I also have a memorandum from a licensed property attorney confirming this interpretation. The violation notice I received is based on an unenforceable rule. I'm requesting that the Board formally withdraw the violation notice tonight. Tom Busby looked at Deborah. Deborah looked at me. The room was completely quiet. The Board will take that under advisement, Deborah said, in the tone of someone who has just discovered her adversary is more prepared than expected, but is not ready to show it. I'd like a formal response in writing within 7 business days, I said. Per the CC&RS, members have a right to written responses on formal challenges to violation notices. A few people in the room made approving sounds. I sat down. Greg leaned over and said, quietly, "That was beautiful." But I wasn't done, and the meeting wasn't done. Phil Garza got up next and talked about the notices that had been sent to 2 homeowners for snow accumulation during the period when he'd been dealing with a flooded basement, and asked whether the Board had any compassion for residents dealing with legitimate winter emergencies, and whether the enforcement priorities made any sense at all. A woman named Corinne Sloan got up and talked about her elderly mother, who lived with her, and the fact that the HOA contracted snow removal company had left ice on the sidewalk in front of her house for 6 days because they were behind, and she'd had to manually treat it herself, and she'd received a notice about using the wrong type of ice melt. Another homeowner talked about the 15% fee increase from last year and asked for a detailed breakdown of where the money was going. That last one landed differently than the others. Deborah answered it with the same administrative and consulting costs line she'd given Sandra, and I watched several people in the room make notes. After the meeting ended and people were putting on coats and exchanging quiet conversations in the cold lobby of the clubhouse, a woman I didn't know well named Teresa Madden came up to me and introduced herself as a CPA who had been a homeowner in Pinecrest Meadows for 3 years. She had a sharp, precise way of talking, and she said, very directly, that the financial presentation at the meeting had anomalies she found concerning, and that she'd also tried to get detailed financials from the Board before and been stonewalled. She said she'd like to see whatever documents I managed to get from my formal records request. I said absolutely. Walking out to the parking lot, I passed Deborah's white SUV, pristine as always even in the middle of all the gray slush and packed ice everywhere else. She was already in it, engine running, and I could see the back of her head behind the frosted window. I didn't look for long. I had things to do. Over the next 2 weeks, the winter got worse before it got better, and so did the situation with Deborah and the HOA. We got another storm the week before Christmas, 10 more inches on top of what was already there, and by that point the neighborhood looked like a science fiction landscape with drifts piled 4 and 5 feet high along the plowed streets, turning every road into a canyon of white. The city's plows had been running around the clock, and the secondary streets still had compressed ice ridges that sent cars sliding sideways at 10 miles per hour. My furnace was working overtime, and my heating bill for November had been nearly $400, which was a new personal record I didn't want to break. I cleared my driveway in the same methodical way I always did, and I pointed my discharge chute wherever was most sensible for each pass, which was generally away from the street and away from neighboring driveways. I had Greg set up one of his trail cameras on his garage eave, angled to cover my driveway and the street in front, on the theory that documented evidence was going to matter before this was all over. He'd bought the camera years ago to try to catch whatever animal had been raiding his bird feeder, and it turned out to be very useful for other purposes too. The HOA's 7-business-day deadline for a written response on my violation notice challenge came and went without a response. On the 8th business day, I sent a follow-up certified letter noting the missed deadline and requesting an immediate written response. I sent a copy to Jake for his files. On Christmas Eve, I got 2 things in the mail. One was a Christmas card from my parents. The other was a letter from the HOA, not in response to my challenge, but a new violation notice. This one cited an alleged violation of the community standards regarding unauthorized structures on my property. The structure in question was my snow blower, which I stored in my backyard when not in use, visible from the alley behind my house. The notice claimed that storage of motorized equipment in an area visible from any community common area required prior approval, citing Article 9, Section 2 of the Community Standards. I stared at this letter for a long time on Christmas Eve, standing in my kitchen in my socks with the snow falling outside and the tree lit up in my living room, and I felt something crystallize inside me. This wasn't about the discharge chute anymore. This wasn't even about the snow blower. This was Deborah Mercer using her position on the HOA board to systematically harass a homeowner who had dared to challenge her authority in public. That was a different thing entirely. I called Jake on Christmas morning after breakfast. He wished me Merry Christmas. I wished him Merry Christmas, and then I told him about the new violation notice. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Ryan, that's retaliation." Issuing violation notices after a homeowner publicly challenges a previous notice and cites their legal rights, targeting items that were never previously cited despite being present before the challenge. That's a pattern of retaliatory conduct. Depending on how your state statutes handle HOA governance, that could expose individual board members to personal liability. "Tell me more about that," I said. He did. At length. I took notes. My coffee got cold and I didn't notice. January came in with a vicious cold snap that had people in the neighborhood talking about furnace issues, frozen pipes, and heating fuel shortages. The propane supplier that served about a third of the neighborhood had run so low in stock that they were rationing deliveries, and 3 households were supplementing with electric space heaters while they waited for their scheduled delivery. One of those households was Marcus Webb, the guy who'd spoken up at the December meeting, and he told me that he'd also received a new violation notice since the meeting, for a different and equally dubious reason. We compared notes. Teresa Madden had received a response to her own records request, which she'd sent after the meeting, and the response she got was incomplete. The financial documents she received were redacted in several places, including the administrative and consulting fees line, with a note that certain information was commercially sensitive. Teresa, who again was a CPA, told me that in her professional opinion that was not a valid basis for redacting records from a member of a nonprofit corporation under state statute. She had consulted her own attorney and was preparing a formal complaint to the state's Office of the Attorney General, which had jurisdiction over nonprofit corporation compliance. That's when things started to accelerate. Greg's trail camera had been running for 3 weeks by mid-January, and one evening he came over with his laptop and showed me something on the footage that I hadn't expected. The camera had a wide enough angle that it captured not just my driveway, but also a portion of the street and the edge of the sidewalk. On 3 separate occasions after dark, the camera had recorded a figure in a white parka walking along the front of my property, stopping, appearing to take photographs with a phone, and walking on. The timestamps were late evening, between 9 and 11 p.m. The figure's build and the distinctive white fur-trimmed parka were unmistakably Deborah Mercer. She was doing nighttime surveillance of my property, looking for violations. In -15-degree weather at 10 in the evening, I saved copies of the footage to 3 separate places. The formal records request I'd sent in December finally got a response in the second week of January. The financial documents I received were more complete than what Teresa had gotten, possibly because mine was a statutory records request under the Nonprofit Corporation Act, and they were more careful about ignoring it entirely. What I got was 90 pages of financial records covering 3 years. I forwarded everything to Teresa the same day, because she was going to understand them far better than I was. Teresa called me 2 days later. "Ryan," she said, and her voice had that particular flatness that professionals use when they're about to tell you something significant, and they want you to understand that it's been carefully considered. "I've been through all 90 pages twice. The administrative and consulting fees are paid to a company called PM Consulting Services, LLC. Over 3 years, the total payments are just over $42,000. $42,000, I repeated. I ran the business registration on PM Consulting Services, LLC. It was registered with the state 2 years ago. The registered agent is Daniel Mercer." I sat very still. "Daniel Mercer, Deborah Mercer's husband," Teresa said. "I looked him up. They've been married for 22 years. Their home address matches the registered address for the company." There it was. Deborah had been directing HOA funds to a company owned by her husband, over $42,000 over 3 years. She had authority over the HOA's contracts and spending. She had effectively sole control over the board, and she had created a revenue stream for her family using the community's money without disclosing the conflict of interest or putting the contracts to competitive bid, both of which were required under the CC and RS, and almost certainly required under state law as well. I called Jake immediately. He stopped what he was doing and listened to everything I had, and when I finished he was quiet for about 10 seconds and then said, "Ryan, this isn't a civil HOA dispute anymore. What you're describing is potential financial fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Depending on the amounts involved, it could be criminal. You need to take this to the county DA's office and also file with the state attorney general's nonprofit division." I spent that weekend preparing documents. I organized everything I had: the violation notices, the certified mail records showing missed deadlines, the CC and RS with my annotations, the meeting minutes, the financial records, Teresa's analysis of the payments to PM Consulting Services, LLC, the business registration showing Daniel Mercer as the owner, and Greg's trail camera footage showing Deborah surveilling my property at night. I made 4 complete copies, one for Jake, one for me, one for the county DA's office, one for the state attorney general. I filed the complaints the following Monday. Jake came with me to the DA's office in person and submitted the package with a cover letter that laid out the case clearly and professionally. The Financial Crimes Unit at the DA's office took the package, scanned our identification, and told us we'd hear from them. I want to be honest about how the next few weeks felt, because it wasn't all triumphant momentum. It was mostly cold, bureaucratic waiting, punctuated by more snowstorms, more violation notices from Deborah, who apparently did not know yet what I'd filed because the notices kept coming with aggressive regularity, and the ongoing general misery of what had turned into one for the record books in terms of winter severity. My heating bill for December was $460. The road in front of my house developed a pothole large enough to cause genuine concern when navigating it in the dark. The HOA's contracted snow removal company was 3 days late after the February storm because their equipment had broken down, and the neighborhood entrance road was a sheet of ice for 60 solid hours, during which period Deborah sent out an email blast to all residents encouraging them to report any slipping hazards, without any apparent awareness of the irony. Sandra Cho had quietly let me know that she'd filed her own complaint with the state, focused on the board's procedural violations and the improper contract awards, and that she'd been talking to a nonprofit governance attorney who confirmed that the unratified guidelines were indeed not enforceable. She also told me that Deborah had been significantly less comfortable in board interactions since the December meeting, which was the only warmth available to me in a February that was doing its absolute worst. The call from the Financial Crimes Unit came in the third week of February. A detective named Sandra Owens asked me to come in and speak with her. I brought Jake. We sat in a government building interview room that had fluorescent lighting and a coffee machine in the hallway that made a sound like a small animal being stepped on. And Detective Owens, who had a no-nonsense demeanor and apparently had already done significant preliminary work on the case, walked us through what they'd found. The short version was that PM Consulting Services, LLC was real, but had no real business activity other than receiving HOA payments. Deborah Mercer had been paid for management consulting that the HOA had no documentation of having received. No meeting minutes reflected any board vote on these contracts. No conflict of interest disclosure had ever been filed, either with the board or in the financial statements. The payments had been classified in the financials in a way that obscured their nature. Detective Owens used the word embezzlement in the same calm, matter-of-fact way that a doctor uses a diagnosis, as though naming something simply makes it clearer. They had been in contact with the state attorney general's office, and the two investigations were being coordinated. Warrants had been obtained. On the last day of February, on a bright and bitterly cold morning when the sky was that particular shade of blue you only get in deep winter, and the snow on the ground had turned to a kind of crystalline crust that crunched underfoot like broken glass, Deborah Mercer and her husband Daniel were arrested at their home on charges including embezzlement, misappropriation of nonprofit funds, and breach of fiduciary duty. Tom Busby, who had apparently known more than he'd let on about the consulting arrangement and had signed off on at least 2 of the contract approvals, was charged as an accessory. I didn't watch the arrest happen. I found out about it the same way most of my neighbors found out, through a phone call from Sandra Cho, who was now the acting board president, and whose call I received while I was standing in my driveway running the Arians through the fresh 3 inches that had fallen overnight. I turned the machine off and stood there in the cold for a moment, holding my phone, looking at the clean swath I'd cut through the snow, the chute still warm from use pointing at a 45-degree angle toward the common grass strip where it had always pointed, and I let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Then I started the machine back up and finished my driveway, because it wasn't going to clear itself. The weeks that followed were busy in a different way. Sandra convened a special membership meeting in early March, the first properly noticed general membership meeting in several years, at which the homeowners voted to adopt a formal governance reform package. The unenforceable board-adopted guidelines were officially tabled pending proper ratification review. A new financial oversight committee was established with Teresa Madden as chair, giving residents actual visibility into how their money was spent. Competitive bidding requirements for all contracts over $500 were formalized and written into the governance procedures. All outstanding violation notices issued in the previous 8 months were reviewed by a 3-person committee that included Sandra Cho, Marcus Webb, and a homeowner named Patricia Solis who had a background in local government. The review found that 31 of the 44 notices issued during that period were either based on the unenforceable board-adopted guidelines or were issued without adequate factual basis. Those 31 notices were formally withdrawn. Mine were among the first to go. The HOA's attorney, who turned out to be a reasonable person who had been working with the board in good faith and had no knowledge of the financial misconduct, advised that the association would likely need to seek restitution from Deborah and Daniel Mercer for the misappropriated funds as part of the civil proceedings that would accompany the criminal case. The insurance carrier for the HOA was notified. It was going to be a long legal process, but the structure was in place to actually pursue it. Phil Garza's burst pipe repair, which had cost him nearly $8,000, turned out to be something that a properly run HOA reserve fund should have been able to help with through an emergency hardship provision that had existed in the CC and RS for years, but had never been used or publicized by the prior board. Sandra's first act as acting president was to get that provision formally publicized and to ensure Phil's case was reviewed. Greg threw a neighborhood cleanup party in late March, when the weather finally broke enough to make it reasonable. It was still cold, maybe 35 degrees, with patches of ice in the shadier spots and muddy slushy piles where the snow had been plowed into corners and was only now beginning to recede, but people came out anyway. About 40 households showed up to help rake out the winter debris from the common areas, spread fresh ice melt on the last stubborn icy patches, and generally take stock of a neighborhood that had been through a rough few months and come out the other side of it. Greg's wife Diane made chili, which seemed right for the occasion, and people stood around in the weak March sunshine in heavy coats, eating chili from paper bowls and talking about everything that had happened. And there was this particular quality to the conversations that I haven't heard in neighborhoods very often. It was the kind of talk that comes when people have been through something together and realize they were stronger for it, that the community was more resilient than they'd given it credit for, and that paying attention and pushing back actually worked. Marcus Webb brought his kid, a 7-year-old who was completely uninterested in HOA governance, but was very interested in the fact that there was still enough snow piled in one corner of the common area to build a respectable snow fort. Phil and Maria Garza brought tamales, which ended up being even more popular than the chili. Patricia Solis had made a sign for the common area notice board that listed the new governance procedures in plain language, and several people stopped to read it and made approving noises. Sandra Cho found me near the end of the afternoon when the cleanup was mostly done and people were starting to drift home as the temperature began dropping again as the sun got low. She was holding her paper bowl and looking at the cleaned-up common area with the expression of someone who is genuinely satisfied by what they're looking at. "How's the snow blower?" she asked. "Running great," I said. "Chute still spins 360 degrees. I'm pointing it wherever seems best." She smiled. "That's the way it should be." "You know what's funny," I said, because something had been sitting in the back of my mind for a while and I'd never quite said it out loud. When Deborah knocked on my door that morning with that violation notice, I almost just paid the fine. It was $50. I thought for half a second, is it worth the fight? $50 is $50. Sandra nodded slowly. "A lot of people make that calculation." "Yeah." I looked out at the neighborhood, at the houses with their winter-beaten lawns just starting to show the faint promise of something green underneath the gray, at the plowed roads that were finally clear and dry, at the children building their snow fort in the last dirty pile of winter. I'm glad I didn't. The criminal case against Deborah and Daniel Mercer moved through the system over the following months. Deborah's attorney tried several angles, including arguing that the HOA payments were legitimate consulting fees that had simply been insufficiently documented, but the complete lack of any deliverable, any meeting, any product, or any business activity at PM Consulting Services, LLC, made that argument difficult to sustain. The prosecution had the financial records, the bank statements showing the money flowing to the Mercer household accounts, and the testimony of Sandra Cho and other board members confirming that the contracts had never been properly disclosed or voted on. Daniel Mercer eventually accepted a plea agreement that included full restitution of the $42,000 plus interest and a substantial fine, along with probation. Deborah pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of breach of fiduciary duty and theft by a person in a position of trust, which in our state carried consequences including a permanent bar from serving as an officer or board member of any homeowners association in the state, a fine, community service, and a suspended sentence with 2 years of probation. Tom Busby, who had been an accessory with less direct involvement, got probation and a smaller fine after cooperating with the prosecution. The restitution money, $42,000 plus interest, came back to the HOA. The board voted to put $32,000 into a long-depleted reserve fund that was supposed to cover major maintenance and emergency repairs, and to use the remainder to fund 2 years of a homeowner assistance program for documented hardship cases. Phil Garza was the first person helped by it, retroactively, getting a partial reimbursement for his burst pipe repairs. The press release the HOA put out about it was written by Teresa Madden and was clear, specific, and completely free of bureaucratic language, which alone felt like a minor revolution. Spring came late that year, as it sometimes does when winter has been particularly stubborn, but it came. The snow that had felt permanent finally gave up, draining away through the gutters and into the ground, leaving behind lawns that needed serious attention and a few things that people had lost in November storms and had completely forgotten about, including one garden gnome that turned up at the edge of Greg's property in mid-April, slightly weathered but otherwise intact. Greg cleaned it off and put it back near his front walk, and nobody said a word about it. I serviced the Arians in April, changed the oil, sharpened the impeller, checked the chute mechanism to make sure it was still rotating freely. The machine had worked hard that winter and it deserved the maintenance. I ran it briefly in the driveway, just to make sure everything was working right, and stood there for a moment in the mild April air with the smell of cut grass starting to mix with the last of the cold as the engine warmed up and the chute spun effortlessly in a full circle. Nobody came to tell me which way to point it. A few weeks later, when the weather was warm enough for people to actually want to be outside, Greg and I were both in our front yards on a Saturday morning. He was setting up a new birdhouse he'd built over the winter, a particularly elaborate one that looked like a miniature Victorian house complete with a tiny porch railing. I was putting away the last of the winter equipment, the snow shovels, the ice melt spreader, the bags of sand I'd kept by the garage door for the worst ice patches. The street was dry. The lawns were green. A couple of kids were riding bikes at the end of the cul-de-sac. Greg looked over at me with that quiet, measured expression he had. "You know what I keep thinking about," he said. "What?" "The birdhouse gnome incident." I stopped what I was doing. "Tell me about the birdhouse gnome incident." He leaned against his garage door with the miniature Victorian birdhouse in his hands. 2 years ago, Deborah issued me a violation notice for a garden gnome I'd had for 6 years. Said it was not in keeping with the neighborhood aesthetic. I moved it to the backyard. Then 3 months later, she issued another notice for a birdhouse I'd put up, said it had to be approved by the grounds committee. I submitted the request and she sat on it for 4 months without responding. 4 months. 4 months. The birds had already moved in by then. He looked at the new birdhouse in his hands with something approaching fondness. "I built this one over the winter during the storms when there wasn't much else to do. I never asked for approval. I'm going to put it up today." He did. He put it up, right there in his front yard where it was clearly visible from the street, and it was genuinely beautiful in the way that handmade things are beautiful, a little imperfect and completely genuine. A couple of neighbors walking by stopped to admire it. Nobody sent a violation notice. That was the real change, I think. more than the arrests or the restitution or even the governance reforms, though all of those things mattered enormously. The real change was that the neighborhood stopped being afraid. People stopped doing the constant mental calculation of whether this thing or that thing might draw Deborah's attention, stopped trimming their behavior to fit the shape of someone else's control. The community started to breathe again, slowly at first, and then more fully as the year went on. The annual HOA meeting in June was a completely different experience from anything I'd heard described. Sandra ran it with a simple, clear agenda. The financial reports were presented by Teresa in plain language, with every line item explained and no redactions. The new governance procedures were formally ratified by a homeowner vote, which made them actually binding for the first time in years. 3 new board positions were opened and filled by volunteers who had no prior involvement with the old board. The whole thing lasted 90 minutes, everyone got a chance to speak, and people left afterward looking like they'd done something useful with their evening, which was a feeling the meeting had apparently not produced in a very long time. I got a text from Jake that evening that just said, "How'd it go?" And I texted back, like a community meeting is supposed to go, and he sent back a simple thumbs up. Later that summer, I ran into Phil Garza and his wife at the neighborhood's 4th of July gathering, which was held in the common area, and was, for the first time in several years, organized by a loose committee of volunteers rather than controlled entirely by the board. Phil's basement had been fully repaired and restored. His pipes hadn't given him any trouble since the new insulation he'd put in. Maria looked genuinely happy in the way she hadn't looked at the December meeting, when Phil was still managing the aftermath of the flood. "You know," Phil said to me, holding a can of soda and watching his kids run across the grass in the summer heat, "when I got that violation notice in December about snow accumulation while my basement was flooding, I almost quit. I almost called a realtor." "I know the feeling," I said. "I'm glad you didn't just pay the $50. "Me too," I said. "The Arians is sitting in my garage right now, covered with a tarp, waiting for next winter. I get it out and look at it sometimes when I'm in there getting something else. And I think about that morning in December when Deborah knocked on my door with her clipboard and her violation notice about the unapproved direction of my discharge chute. I think about how absurd it was, and how it was also not absurd at all, because it was the visible tip of something much larger and more serious that had been operating in our community for years. I think about how the smallest, most ridiculous thing can sometimes be exactly the thread that, when you pull on it, unravels the whole wrong tangle. The chute can point in any direction I want. It always could. I just had to say so. And I think about this community, Pinecrest Meadows, which had let itself get very small for a long time under the weight of one person's ambition and control, and which turned out to be much larger and more capable than it had believed. Phil and his burst pipes. Greg and his birdhouses, Teresa with her 90 pages of financial records, Sandra who'd been waiting 2 years for someone else to start pushing, Marcus with his snow shovel, all of them just neighbors living their lives, waiting for someone to say out loud what they already knew. I was happy to be the guy with the snow blower. Next winter can do whatever it wants. I'll be ready.